Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is part 2 of the lesson on artifacts and workflows. The key points you need to remember about the project management plan are that it contains many component management plans from the other knowledge areas and elsewhere, including scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource, communications, risk, procurement, and stakeholder engagement. In addition, management plans for requirements, change, and configuration. The project management plan also includes these key baselines: scope, schedule, cost, and performance measurement, and may include other baselines, as there may be other management plans and documents that are baselined. The project lifecycle description, the development approach, and the schedule of management reviews. If you understand that these are the basic components of the project management plan, that will help you to understand when input from the project management plan is important to a process and when updates to the project management plan are important. Scope management planning is quite involved and detailed and has many steps. But it's really quite simple if you think of it and remember it in terms of the artifacts and how the different processes convert all of these different artifacts from one thing to another, or are used as inputs to create a new output. It all starts with the develop project charter process, which is part of the initiating process group and part of integration. That generates the project charter, which is a key input to your first scope planning process, which is collect requirements. Your first requirements are going to be in the project charter, because some of those will have already been identified at a high level. So it only makes sense that the project charter is your main input. You don't yet have a full project plan or anything else that would provide the basis of your inputs for collect requirements, so it's the project charter. Then collect requirements is all about collecting the desired requirements from your key stakeholders. This results naturally in your requirements documentation and your requirements traceability matrix. Then it's time to decide which of these requirements are going to be included in the scope of your project, which is why the next process is define scope. And the output of define scope is a project scope statement, which is that detailed document that we talked about that includes a statement of everything that's in the project scope. Once we have that document, we then need to create the work breakdown structure. So create WBS is your next process. And using your project scope statement as input, you create this hierarchical structure that is the work breakdown structure. At the same time, you'll be creating the work breakdown structure dictionary. And so the output of create WBS is your scope baseline, which includes the project scope statement, which was an input, as well as the WBS and WBS dictionary that you created during create WBS. If you remember this process flow and focus on the key inputs and outputs of key artifacts, remembering the scope planning processes will be much easier, and you won't have to worry about trying to memorize all of the little ITTOs. Now that we've looked at scope, it's time to switch gears and look at schedule management artifacts. These include, of course, the schedule management plan, also the activity list and activity attributes, the list of milestones, your project schedule network diagram, your duration of estimates and basis of estimates, and of course, your schedule baseline. Your project schedule, your schedule data, all of your project schedules, and after planning, you'll have schedule forecasts. Now we look at how these artifacts feed in to the different processes and build upon each other. The first process in schedule management planning is to define the activities. You already have a work breakdown structure, which defines all of the work packages, and now it's time to define the activities that are needed for that. What do you need as inputs? You need that scope baseline, which includes the scope statement, the WBS, and the WBS dictionary. You also need your project schedule. Why is this listed? Because this may not be your first time through on planning. If you're doing some replanning and some adjustments, you'll certainly want to use your project schedule as an input. In order to define your activities, you'll need some resource requirements. That actually comes from a different knowledge area, but is an important input into defining those activities that are needed. Defining activities naturally results in your activity list and your activity attributes, as well as a milestone list. Once you have your activities, then you need to sequence them. And the output of sequence activities is your project schedule network diagram, which does not yet include activity durations. That's next. Estimate activity durations. The output is the duration of estimates and the basis of estimates. Of course, these two go together, because every time you do an estimate, you need to also generate your basis of estimates. Once you have all of that, then you can develop your project schedule using develop schedule as your process. And its output will be your schedule baseline, your project schedule, your schedule data, and all of your project calendars. Remember to keep in mind the difference between these three key schedule artifacts: the schedule model, the schedule baseline, and schedule presentations. The schedule model is that collection of all of the activities, durations, dependencies, and everything about the schedule, all as one abstract collection of information about the schedule. The schedule baseline is the approved version of the schedule, specifically the schedule model. When you refer to a project schedule, you're actually not usually referring to the model, but you're referring to a particular presentation of that schedule model. A presentation in the form of bar charts, Gantt charts, milestone charts, network diagrams, or what have you. And now we turn to your key cost management artifacts. These start with the cost management plan and cost estimates, which naturally includes your basis of estimates, your cost baseline, and also your project funding requirements and cost forecasts. Your first task in cost planning is to estimate costs. So that's your first process, estimate costs. In order to estimate costs, you naturally need to know information about the scope, schedule, and resources available to you. So your inputs are the scope baseline, the project schedule, and the resource requirements. The outputs, of course, from estimate costs are your cost estimates and your basis of estimates. From this, you can then determine your budget using the determine budget process, which generates your cost baseline and your project funding requirements. Your streamlined list of quality management artifacts includes, of course, your quality management plan, also your quality metrics and quality reports, test and evaluation documents, quality control measurements, and verified deliverables. Though we haven't specifically mentioned it here, you already know that each of the knowledge areas has its own process for creating that knowledge area's management plan. For example, for scope, you have the plan scope management process, which creates the scope management plan. The schedule knowledge area has plan schedule management as a process, and as its output, the schedule management plan. Also for cost, plan cost management creates the cost management plan. The same is true for the other knowledge areas, including quality. Plan quality management creates as its output a quality management plan. However, there is another key output here that I'd like to focus on because of how it relates to some other key quality management artifacts. That is quality metrics. Plan quality management defines your quality metrics that you will be using to manage quality within your project. Those metrics are used by the control quality process, which measures using those metrics and outputs the quality control measurements. These measurements are then used by the manage quality process, and the output of manage quality is quality reports. Your key resource management artifacts include the resource management plan, the team charter, resource requirements, the basis of estimates, resource breakdown structure, physical resource requirements, your project team assignments, your resource calendars, and your team performance assessments. Just as was the case with quality management, your resource management process of plan resource management outputs not only your resource management plan, but also another key output, the team charter. These are used as inputs to your process to estimate your activity resources, which naturally outputs your resource requirements and your basis of these estimates of resource requirements, as well as your resource breakdown structure. Do you remember the organizational breakdown structure? It's kind of a hybrid between the work breakdown structure and the resource breakdown structure. It takes the work breakdown structure and reorganizes it so that each work package is under the appropriate department or division or team of your organization. It basically follows your organizational structure so that each unit, department, division, or whatever in your organization can consult with the organizational breakdown structure, look at their section, and see what work they're responsible for. Now, notice the organizational breakdown structure is not mentioned here. In fact, it's not mentioned as an output in any of the processes in the PMBOK guide. But this is definitely an artifact that would be an output of some process. Knowing what the organizational breakdown structure is and what it's used for, you should be able to guess which process would generate this, even though the PMBOK guide doesn't specifically mention it. It would naturally be an output of estimate activity resources, because until then, you don't know which resources you're planning on using and which departments they're in. So it's got to be at the same time that you're figuring out your resource requirements and developing your resource breakdown structure. You see how understanding the artifacts and what they're used for and what's used as inputs in order to create them is so valuable for you in understanding when and how they're created. This is so much easier than trying to memorize the lists, which aren't complete anyway. Let's continue looking at some more of these resource management artifacts and how they connect to the processes. Once you have your resource requirements and your basis of estimates and your resource breakdown structure, and possibly your organizational breakdown structure, those serve as inputs to acquiring the resources. Of course, as you acquire resources, you would need to know this information. And once you've acquired those resources, what do you naturally have? You now have your physical resource assignments and your project team assignments and your resource calendars, which tell you when each of these resources is available. Those are naturally the inputs to developing your team. As you're developing your team, you make assessments. The main output of that is team performance assessments, which are, of course, inputs to managing your team. Although communications can take up as much as 90% of your time as a project manager, there are really only two key communications management artifacts. These are the Communications Management Plan, which of course is the main output of planned communications management, and all of the various project communications, which are the output of the process of managed communications. There are some other interesting workflows here, but we'll come to those later. And now we come to one of my favorites, the risk management artifacts. These include the risk management plan, the risk register, and the risk report, and also a few artifacts that aren't listed as documents, the qualitative risk analysis, the quantitative risk analysis, and the risk responses. Let's see how these all relate. The first process in risk management, that is, after, of course, the plan risk management process, which generates the risk management plan, is the identify risks process, which, of course, generates your risk register and risk report. But then you have a couple of interesting processes. The first is the perform qualitative risk analysis, which generates the qualitative risk analysis, which is actually stored in the risk register and risk report. In the PMBOK guide, you'll see risk register and risk report listed as outputs, or updates to them listed as outputs of this process. However, it's the qualitative risk analysis that's the key artifact generated by this process that is included in these other artifacts. The same is true for perform quantitative risk analysis, which generates the quantitative risk analysis artifact, which is included then in the risk register and risk report. All of this information, which is now included in these key artifacts and analyses that are embedded in the risk register and risk report, are important inputs to planning risk responses. Naturally, you can't plan your risk responses without these analyses. These risk responses are then recorded again in the risk register and to some degree in the risk report. You then implement these risk responses, and any updates or changes, again, go into the risk register and risk report. You monitor these risks and record your monitoring information in the risk register and risk report. It's interesting that when it comes to risk management, there's a lot of important artifacts, but they are embedded in or buried in the risk register and risk report. So just looking at the inputs and outputs doesn't make it immediately obvious why these are inputs and outputs. So it's important for you to understand the quantitative and qualitative analyses that are included in the risk register. It's time to take a break, so that's the end of part 2. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.